His name is Brian Kranz. In 2009, at 34 years old, Brian filed for personal bankruptcy. He owed $340,000 credit cards, a home equity loan he'd cashed out to invest in a friend's restaurant, and a lease on a BMW he'd stopped being able to afford 8 months earlier. That part isn't unusual. A lot of people go broke at 34. Here's what's unusual. In 2017, 8 years later, Brian had rebuilt. He had $1.1 million in liquid assets, a paid-off house, 2 income streams. He was, by every reasonable measure, financially free. By 2021, he had $11,000 to his name. Again. The second collapse was faster, more efficient, almost elegant in how completely it worked. When I found Brian's story through a bankruptcy attorney who agreed to connect me with former clients willing to go on record, I expected to find recklessness, gambling, addiction, something obvious. What I found instead was something far more disturbing. I found a pattern, the same decisions, made in the same emotional sequence, producing the same result 8 years apart, with different numbers attached. Brian didn't have a money problem. Brian had a psychology problem with a money symptom. And when I started pulling on that thread, I found 5 more people with the same thread running through their lives. Different incomes, different countries, different industries. Same pattern. This video is about that pattern. Not the surface version, the budgeting advice, the investment tips, the stop buying coffee version that fills every financial YouTube channel you've ever clicked away from. The real version, the one that operates underneath all of that, the one that no spreadsheet touches. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you are going to recognize this pattern in your own life, in your own decisions, in choices you made last month that you couldn't fully explain at the time. And that recognition, that moment of honest self-confrontation, is worth more than any financial advice I could give you. Kevin was a financial analyst. Not a struggling one, a good one. He spent 12 years at a mid-size asset management firm in Chicago, reading balance sheets for a living, identifying risk, advising clients on exactly what not to do with their money. He was, professionally, one of the most financially literate people in the room. Any room. In 2018, Kevin was 41. He had a $280,000 salary, a growing 401 CAC, and a marriage that had been quietly deteriorating for about 3 years. He started day trading. Not because he needed the money. He'll tell you that clearly. He started because he was bored, because his job had become mechanical, because his marriage didn't have room for him to be the smartest person in it anymore, and because day trading, at least in the beginning, gave him something his actual life wasn't giving him. It made him feel sharp again. The first 6 months, he made $43,000 on top of a $280,000 salary. He was good at this. Of course he was. He'd spent 12 years studying markets. He told his wife she was uncomfortable, and he told himself, she just didn't understand finance. Year 2, he'd moved $200,000 from their joint savings into his trading account. He hadn't exactly told her. He'd told himself he'd put it back when the position closed. He'd told himself a lot of things. I want to stop here because I think there's something important to name. Kevin wasn't an idiot. Kevin wasn't reckless in the conventional sense. Kevin was doing something that intelligent people in pain do constantly. He was using competence as an emotional escape hatch. When your personal life is unmanageable, your brain will look for a domain where you feel in control, where your intelligence is the answer, where you can win. For Kevin, that domain was markets. And the market, as markets do, was perfectly happy to take his money while letting him feel like he was winning. Because here's the thing about short-term trading wins. They are not evidence of skill. They are evidence of variance. The market gives and the market takes. And in the beginning, it almost always gives. That's not generosity. That's the setup. By 2020, Kevin had lost $380,000. The joint savings were gone. The marriage was gone. He was still employed, but just barely, because his actual job performance had declined in exact proportion to the amount of emotional energy he was pouring into his trading screens. He told me this, sitting in his apartment in Evanston, with a kind of stillness that only comes after you've fully metabolized a catastrophe. I knew what I was doing was wrong. Not illegal wrong, emotionally wrong. I knew I was trying to trade my way out of a failing marriage. I knew the money was secondary, and I kept going anyway. Because stopping meant sitting with what was actually happening in my life, and I wasn't ready to do that. That sentence is the whole story. He wasn't trading, he was hiding, with very expensive cover. Here is what Kevin's story is actually about. Financial self-destruction almost never looks like what we think it looks like. It rarely looks like impulsive recklessness. It usually looks like competence. It looks like confidence. It looks like someone who knows what they're doing something for reasons they haven't admitted yet, even to themselves. The most dangerous financial decisions are the ones that feel completely rational in the moment. Kevin is in therapy now. He's rebuilt about $60,000. He's not in a hurry. He says the rebuilding feels different this time because for the first time, he actually knows why the first version collapsed. In 2019, a 9-year-old woman named Melissa inherited $340,000 from her grandmother. She had never had more than $8,000 in her account at any single point in her life. Within 26 months, the money was gone. Not spent on drugs, not stolen, not lost in the market. Gone in the way that money goes when someone receives more than their internal sense of self believes they should have slowly, purposefully, almost bureaucratically dismantled. Melissa grew up lower middle class in rural Ohio. Her father worked at a plant that closed when she was 14. Her teenage years were defined by the specific texture of financial anxiety, the kind where you don't talk about money because talking about money means admitting there isn't enough. The kind where a $200 car repair is a crisis that reorganizes the entire month. She worked hard. She got herself out. By 29, she was a nurse, making decent money, managing fine, living within her means. And then $340,000 arrived, and something happened that financial advisors don't put in their brochures. She panicked. Not visibly, not dramatically. She panicked quietly, internally, in the way the nervous system panics when reality contradicts a deeply held belief. And her deeply held belief, installed over 29 years of watching her family struggle, was that people like her don't have $340,000. That kind of money belongs to a different kind of person, a person she wasn't sure she was. The technical term for what happened next is sudden wealth syndrome. Therapists who work with lottery winners, inheritance recipients, and athletes who sign large contracts see it constantly. The symptoms look like bad decisions. The actual cause is an identity that hasn't caught up with the bank balance. Melissa lent $40,000 to her brother, who needed to get out of debt. He paid back $6,000. She bought a house, which is not inherently bad, but bought it in a market she didn't understand, with a mortgage structure she didn't fully read. In a neighborhood she chose because it felt like where a person with money should live, rather than where she actually wanted to be. She quit her job for 4 months to figure out what she really wanted, a luxury her nervous system couldn't actually tolerate. So she spent those 4 months anxious and unproductive and burning through savings. She made several investments based on advice from people in her life who she suddenly had more contact with than before the inheritance. Everyone had ideas, she told me. Everyone knew someone, or had a business, or had a cousin who needed capital, and I couldn't say no. Because saying no felt like proving that money had changed me, and I was so desperate to prove it hadn't changed me that I gave it all away to prove I was still the same person. She gave the money away to prove she hadn't changed. And in doing so, proved she hadn't changed. Think about the circularity of that. She came from nothing. She got everything. And she returned to nothing, not by accident, but by unconsciously reasserting the identity that felt most true. Melissa is not a cautionary tale about stupidity. She is a case study in what happens when the size of your bank account outpaces the size of your self-concept. Money doesn't transform you. Your relationship with money transforms you, but only if you do the work to change it deliberately. Otherwise, your old self-concept will simply contract back to its original size and take the money with it. She's back nursing. She's working with a financial therapist, a profession that most people don't know exists, but probably should. She's rebuilding, carefully, with a very different understanding of what she's building and why. And she said something in our last conversation that I want you to write down if you're the kind of person who writes things down. The money wasn't the test. The money just revealed how I already felt about myself. That was the test, and I failed it. But at least now, I know what the test actually is. I want to talk about something that nobody in personal finance talks about honestly. The social cost of not looking wealthy. Not in a shallow way, in a structural way. In the way that affects real decisions made by real people who are trying to navigate real, professional, and social environments where the signals you send about money have actual consequences. James is 37. He grew up in a working-class family in South London, got a scholarship to study economics, went into finance, and by 32 was earning £110,000 a year at a firm in the city. He was also spending £108,000 a year. When I first heard that number, I assumed lifestyle inflation, the usual story. But James's breakdown of where the money went is more interesting than that and more honest. About 30% of his excess spending went on things that were genuinely personal: nicer flat, better holidays, good restaurants, reasonable. But the other 70%? He described it as the cost of admission. The suits that signaled he belonged in certain rooms. The watch that communicated to certain clients that he was the kind of person whose advice was worth taking. The golf club membership, £4,200 a year, that was not about golf, but about access to conversations that happened on golf courses. The dinners he hosted for colleagues that were not social events, but professional infrastructure. I was not spending money to show off, he told me. I was spending money to be taken seriously. And for a while, I couldn't work out where one ended and the other began. This is real, and it is genuinely complicated. Research on workplace signaling, particularly a study out of Harvard Business School in 2019, found that in high-status professional environments, the way you present yourself financially affects how your competence is perceived, not fairly, but actually. James wasn't being paranoid. He was operating in an environment with real, if unspoken, rules about what you had to spend to be taken seriously. The problem was that those rules had no ceiling. The watch needed upgrading. The flat needed to be in a better postcode. The golf club needed to be a more prestigious golf club. Every signal, once normalized, needed to be escalated to remain a signal. And underneath all of it, underneath the very legitimate professional justifications, was something James took 3 years to admit. He was terrified that if he stopped performing wealth, people would look closer. And if they looked closer, they'd see where he came from. And if they saw where he came from, they'd stop believing he belonged. The spending wasn't professional strategy. It was psychological armor. By 35, James had no savings, no investments, a salary that looked transformative from the outside and produced nothing durable from the inside, and a growing awareness that the armor had become the problem. He left the firm, took a lower-paying role at a smaller company where the culture didn't require the performance, cut the spending, started aggressively building. He told me something that took me a long time to sit with. The most expensive thing I owned was the version of myself I was performing. And the day I retired, that character, the expensive version of me that I had built for other people's consumption, was the day I could actually afford my real life. This one is different from the others. Because this one isn't about one person making bad decisions. This one is about two people who were, individually, reasonably financially responsible, and together, financially catastrophic. Rachel and Daniel met in their late 20s. Both had decent incomes, minimal debt, and generally sensible habits. By 34 and 36, they were married, combined their finances, and had a household income of $195,000 in Denver. By 40 and 42, they were $310,000 in debt, not including the mortgage, and seeing a financial therapist to figure out how two financially competent adults had produced this result together. What the therapist found was not recklessness, it was conflict avoidance. Rachel and Daniel did not have the same relationship with money. Rachel came from a family where saving was a moral value, where spending freely felt irresponsible, even shameful. Daniel came from a family where money was for living, where scarcity mindset was the enemy, where enjoying life now was a virtue because his father had spent his whole life saying, "When I retire," and died at 61 before he got there. These were not just different preferences. These were different moral frameworks, different worldviews, different definitions of what it meant to be a good person with money. And they never talked about it. Not really. Because every time the topic came up, it felt like an accusation. Rachel's frugality felt to Daniel like she was calling him irresponsible. Daniel's spending felt to Rachel like a rejection of everything her family had taught her mattered, so they avoided it. They compromised in the moment, which usually meant Daniel's preference won, because Rachel found it easier to concede than to fight. Every big purchase we made, I agreed to, even when I didn't want to, because I didn't want to be the person who ruined things, who killed the mood, who couldn't just enjoy life like he could. So I said yes, and then I resented it for months afterward. And then we'd have the fight we should have had before the purchase, except now we couldn't undo what we'd already done. The debt was not the product of two people spending wildly. It was the product of two people making thousands of small financial decisions inside a dynamic that made honesty more threatening than agreement. The avoidance was the spending. This is not rare. Couples therapists and financial therapists will tell you that money conflict avoidance is one of the most reliable predictors of long-term financial damage in partnerships. Not fighting about money, which is uncomfortable but functional, avoiding the fight, letting the silence accumulate into debt. Rachel and Daniel are still together. They've paid off about $80,000 of the debt. They have a standing money conversation scheduled, structured, 10 minutes every Sunday that their therapist prescribed and that both of them describe as the most uncomfortable and useful practice they've ever built into their marriage. Rachel told me, "We spent 11 years finding every possible way to not talk about money, and every year of not talking about it cost us. The conversation we were afraid to have was less painful than the silence we chose instead." Which brings us back to Brian. Brian Kranz, bankrupt at 34, rebuilt to $1.1 million by 42, broke again at 46. When I first read his case, I thought there would be an external explanation, a market crash, a health crisis, a fraud, some event from outside that could reasonably account for the collapse. There was no event. There was a sequence of decisions, small ones, spread over 4 years, each of which looked defensible in isolation and amounted to destruction in aggregate. He cashed out an investment account early to fund a business he knew was undercapitalized but felt guilty saying no to because the person asking was a close friend. He bought a second property at the wrong time in the wrong market, not because the numbers worked, but because his father had always told him that real estate was how you protected yourself, and at some level, Brian still ran on his father's financial operating system. He stopped meeting with his financial advisor because the meetings had started to produce advice he didn't want to hear, and it was easier to cancel than to argue. None of those things, individually, are catastrophic. Together, they were. When I sat with Brian and laid the sequence out, decision by decision, with the emotional context he'd shared over 3 separate conversations, he was quiet for a long time. And then he said, "I did it again, didn't I? I did it for the same reasons. The reasons just looked different." Yes. Brian's first bankruptcy at 34 was driven by guilt. He had co-signed on debt for his ex-wife that he knew he shouldn't, because he couldn't tolerate her disappointment. The restaurant investment, the BMW, all of it was, at its core, Brian's spending to manage other people's feelings about him. His second collapse at 46 was also driven by guilt. The undercapitalized business, the property bought to honor his dead father's worldview. The advisor he stopped seeing because the advisor was holding a mirror Brian didn't want to look into. Different decade, different numbers, different specific decisions. Same emotional operating system, running unexamined underneath everything. This is what nobody tells you about rebuilding after financial failure. The money rebuilds. The account balance goes back up. The income comes back. The external markers of recovery become real. But if you do not do the actual work, the uncomfortable, unglamorous, therapist-required work of understanding why the first collapse happened at the level of psychology rather than logistics, then you have not actually rebuilt. You have rebuilt the set, the scenery, the props, and the same play will run again, with slightly better production value. Brian is working with a therapist now who specializes in financial behavior. He described their first session to me in a way I haven't been able to stop thinking about. She asked me, "When you imagine having a lot of money, real, stable, secure wealth, what's the first emotion that comes up? Not the thought, the emotion." And I sat there for a while, and the honest answer was, dread. I feel dread, because I know I'm going to have to spend it managing how other people feel about me having it. And at some level, it's easier to not have it. Dread. A man who had built over $1 million described his emotional response to wealth as dread. And that dread, never named, never examined, never brought into the light, had quietly made every major financial decision of his adult life. His therapist gave him a framework I want to leave you with. She calls it the 3 questions. Before any significant financial decision, not just big ones, but any decision that carries real weight, ask yourself 3 things. What is the financial logic of this decision? What is the emotional logic of this decision? If those 2 are different, which one is actually driving me? That's it. 3 questions. They will not fix everything, but they will show you the gap, the space between what you tell yourself you're doing and what you're actually doing. And in that gap is where all the real money gets lost. Kevin lost $380,000 day trading his way out of a marriage he wasn't ready to leave. Melissa received $340,000 and gave it away to prove she hadn't changed. James spent 11 years paying the premium on a version of himself he built for other people. Rachel and Daniel built $310,000 in debt through 11 years of conversations they chose not to have. And Brian lost everything twice the second time, with more money and more efficiency and the same emotional operating system running underneath. None of these are stories about financial ignorance. All of them are stories about self-knowledge, about the distance between what we say we're doing with money and what we're actually doing. About the emotions, guilt, fear, shame, dread, the need for approval that sit in the driver's seat while our rational financial mind rides in the back and tells itself it's in control. You cannot spreadsheet your way out of an emotional problem. The financial advice is real. The strategies work. The investing principles, the savings rates, the compounding math, all of it is true and all of it matters. But none of it holds if the person executing it is running a script they haven't read. If this video landed differently than you expected, that's intentional. This channel is not here to make you feel good about money. It's here to make you think clearly about it. And thinking clearly starts with being honest about what's actually happening. Subscribe if you want more of that. Share this with someone who needs it, not as a criticism, as a gift. I'll see you in the next one.